Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second week of our online summer class. We had some amazing heat here in Delhi over the past few days, which will hopefully get us through the cool down coming next week. You guys are all over the place, so I hope you have good weather too, and know that you're looking for more than a discussion of just the weather here. So, this week's readings explore a narrative with which many of you are familiar: the rebellion of the English North American colonists. Sorry, I made a typo here. Followed by an establishment of a republican form of government checked by a constitution. But I think Lepore presents this narrative in a new, refreshing way. For decades, we've had conflict between historians looking to give voice to those who have traditionally been ignored in our history books, and those who worry that giving voice to subaltern, forgotten people somehow undermines the greatness of American history. What I love about Lepore is that she celebrates the accomplishments of America, giving us a very traditional sounding political history narrative, while not ignoring the horrible suffering and oppression that's also part of our history. She gives voice to as many people as possible and does it so well. When I read how seamlessly she incorporated both George Washington and his slave Harry Washington into the same narrative, I was absolutely sold on this book. They are part of the same story: African American history, immigrant history, Native American history, women's history, LGBT history, and the histories of anyone who has ever been oppressed or forgotten are not separate histories. Of course, they can be written as such, but they should be part of the main story of our country and who we are as Americans. And Lepore, I think, has given all of them their justice. So, one of my favorite little subplots she weaves into this is the story of Benjamin Lay. He's an amazing person. I made the point last week that people resisted slavery from the very beginning, but by mid-18th century in America, slavery was very much commonplace. It was an evil that, if not necessarily seen by all people, was still part of people's everyday lives. The products they consumed, the profits they earned, and the surpluses that built the bustling cities across colonial America were all products of slave labor. It had become so ingrained that to really protest against it, one had to reject the entire society built on slavery. And Benjamin Lay did just that by living in a cave, growing his own food, so he could know that his life in no way benefited from slavery. He had the chutzpah to decry not just slavery, but any form of oppression that he was familiar with. I love Lepore's detail that Benjamin Franklin had a portrait of Lay up in his house, and we can surmise that Lay very well might have been the one who changed Benjamin Franklin's attitudes towards slavery, at least the attitudes of his wife, which eventually changed his as well. So, last week I talked about Quakers a bit, and while Quakers were early in their opposition to slavery, there was a turning point that occurred in the aftermath of the American Revolution, eventually leading to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, the first of the colonial powers to come out against slavery, decades before the American Emancipation Proclamation. In 1781, there was a particularly ugly example of the disregard for human life that can come when slavery was mixed with modern economics. The Zong was the name of a slave ship that got lost on its way to Jamaica. In order to make sure that they didn't run out of supplies, because they were lost in the ocean, crew members threw 130 slaves overboard before reaching their destination. The owners of the ship then had the audacity to attempt to collect insurance payments on their lost property. Olaudah Equiano and Granville Sharp found out about this and pushed for the owners of the ship to be tried for murder. The egregiousness of this example mobilized people across the Atlantic world against slavery, but especially in Great Britain. What these ship owners did, though, was perfectly legal and so obviously morally wrong. They were never tried for murder, but also never received insurance payments for the people they murdered. In this slide, I mentioned a few other points, like Alice Kerwin's early tract against slavery, but I also mentioned the founding of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which would set a precedent for Americans to later follow. So again, what I'm trying to do is just give you a little bit of a background to the slavery narrative that Lepore is so seamlessly working into her narrative that's generally written by other sources in a more celebratory nature of the beginning of America's institutions of republicanism and democracy. So one of the founding members of that society I just mentioned, though, Olaudah Equiano, had previously formed, sorry, I've got loads of typos, had previously formed a group known as the Sons of Africa, made up largely of freed American slaves who had gone to England after the American Revolution. We'll talk more about these people later. As an eloquent former slave himself, though, Equiano showed the British public that Africans were people too, and importantly, mobilized the voices of former slaves against slavery. Equiano was also a founding member of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which used methods like boycotts of sugar and newspaper editorials to eventually convince Parliament that slavery was both immoral and unprofitable. In 1807, England abolished the slave trade and abolished slavery in all of its colonies. One person whose ideas were instrumental in showing that slavery was not just immoral but illogical was Adam Smith. We remember him as an economist today, the father of capitalism, which means those of us who worry about capitalism's excesses might not see him in the most favorable light. Smith himself, though, never used the term economist. It wasn't around yet. He instead called himself a moral philosopher. Smith believed that if people could be in charge of their own affairs, that they would make decisions that would benefit society as a whole. As a classical liberal, he felt that government needed to allow for total freedom, for an invisible hand then to regulate economies. Then, if people worked according to their own self-interest, forces like competition would encourage people to provide the best product at the lowest prices. In this equation, there was no room for monopolies like the big mercantilist companies of his day, and absolutely no room for slavery. Slavery wasn't bad just for slaves. It was bad for everyone, because it caused unfair competition with free laborers, took consumers out of the economy, and most importantly, took intelligent people out of society with all of their potential innovations that would benefit everyone. That's the core of liberalism. When people have personal liberties, it's better not just for the individuals, but for society as a whole. That's why he called himself a moral philosopher. His most prominent work then, The Wealth of Nations, actually came out in 1776. He was also a supporter of the Americans' desire for representation in Parliament. I want to jump back in time just a bit to the period and a person that we did already discuss last week and give just a little more background on the idea of liberalism, ideas that would be so critical to the American Revolution. Liberalism emerged out of the Enlightenment in an era when there was faith in the power of human beings to make sense of and conquer the uncertainty of life through rational scientific endeavor. John Locke argued that there are certain rights that are natural rights, or debatably among the many deists of early America, God-given rights. Any government exists through a social contract to guarantee these basic rights. Liberalism in the classical sense is that the role of government is nothing beyond the bare minimum to ensure these rights. Starting in the late 17th century, in the British Isles, among other places, you had thinkers who argued that the Enlightenment needed to include rights, what John Locke would call natural rights. In Locke's writings on the social contract, he argued that humanity once lived in a state of nature, building on Hobbes' ideas, where they had total freedom. But because they had the freedom to do anything, there was really no freedom at all because everyone was a victim to everyone else's whims. Governments emerged as people gave up only those rights, which would increase the liberty of everyone else. This is the basic idea of the social contract between government and those it governs. So if you lose your right to rob and murder, for example, but gain a right to live and have possessions, it's worth it. So when he wrote the English Bill of Rights in 1688, he argued that governments had a duty to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. This is the beginning of classical liberalism. Another prominent Scottish thinker was David Hume, who became known for, among other things, a reinvigoration of the old Greek idea of skepticism. The way he reimagined it, one should not take anything for granted, but question everything. This becomes key to political ideas like the divine right of kings, to which Hume would respond, says who? Hume's ideas really invited intellectuals and eventually broader populations to question the world as they saw it. The 18th century became, in many parts of the world, an exciting intellectual atmosphere where people felt free to imagine entirely new social and political orders. Imaginings would have the most impact in one of the more oppressive places to live in the 1700s, France, where people like Rousseau built on Locke's ideas and argued governments had a duty to do the most good for the most people. We talked a bit about these folks last week too. First, Rousseau, his idea of doing things for the greater good, would eventually gain a nasty connotation as it became a later justification for the terror during the French Revolution. Rousseau didn't live to see that, though. Montesquieu then argued that different government types have different virtues and are better for different kinds of people. Naturally, absolutist rulers used his ideas a lot to argue that their absolutism was best for their own people. Then on the side here, you have, on the right-hand side, you have Voltaire, who was lighthearted yet profound, kind of in the vein of modern-day political comics. One of his major contributions was that liberalism could only work with tolerance, that tolerance of especially religious differences was crucial to a successful republican form of government. I considered assigning a chapter from a book called The Sugar Barons, which outlines the oppression inflicted on the island of Barbados, typo again, over several centuries as it became one of the most profitable and horrifying regions of the British Empire. I didn't, but want to cover the gist of that reading in a quick slide. So the book follows a few families who grew fabulous fortunes, and it was Barbados Sugar in particular that developed a stranglehold over Parliament. After the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, when the British government needed desperately to raise revenues to pay off its war debts, one of the first things Parliament did was to pass a Sugar Act, which many keen American observers saw not so much as a way to pay for the war, but as a corporate giveaway to the sugar planters, much like the earlier Molasses Act and mercantilist policies had obligated American traders to purchase only the products of British sugar plantations, which American traders, notorious for their smuggling, rarely followed. Across the Caribbean, however, there's a sickening human cost to this wealth. The average life expectancy for slaves brought from Africa was less than 2 decades. Some estimates are even lower. I've seen estimates as low as that the average slave brought from Africa only survived 5 years in many of the horrifying conditions of the Caribbean. So that's why I mentioned earlier that one of the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade's policies was to simply boycott sugar. People across the British Isles took pride in drinking their tea with no sugar. And obviously, I want you to see what a significant factor these sugar planters were in motivating the disgust that North Americans, especially New Englanders who didn't, for the most part, have slaves, felt with the British Empire. So far I've been discussing the juxtaposition of liberal ideas in both economics and politics to slavery and the power of slavery over Atlantic world governments. And it's so important to see that juxtaposition, that the most progressive liberal ideas were coexisting side by side with some of the most horrific ideologies that justified the total oppression of an entire people. There's more. So the 18th century was one of ridiculous wars. Over and over again, there were wars fought for rival dynastic claims over wanting to maintain balances of power, and importantly, over wanting to maintain monopolistic control over commodities coming out of the Americas. As the 18th century progressed, Americans did more and more of their own fighting at the behest of their colonial masters in Britain. The French and Indian War is one that actually started in America, but it wasn't just fought there. It was a global war pitting rival colonial powers and their allies against each other all over the world. In the end, Great Britain was wildly victorious, laying claim to virtually all of French possessions in North America. The problem was that the British wanted the Americans to pay their fair share of taxes. They, after all, had just gained an empire for themselves, while putting the government into debt. The Americans, who raised and provisioned their own armies, felt like they didn't owe Parliament anything. And Last of the Mohicans is set in this conflict. So, as opposition to taxation rose in the British North American colonies, Americans found a simple soundbite, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, to interpret their disdain for oppressive taxes, something people almost universally dislike. It was no taxation without representation. Basically, that without direct representation in Parliament, they could not countenance any of the taxes being levied. This little couplet almost perfectly epitomizes the liberal ideology I've been droning on about for the first 4 pages today. So hopefully you can put that into context and think about its relevance to these truths. The 1770s then have several important turning points that led to outright rebellion by the middle of the decade. First, in 1770, there was the Boston Massacre, when a riot against the oppressive nature of a military occupation was met with force and 5 people died. The only reason that this was relevant was because Bostonians made it so, living in perhaps the most literate part of the world at that time, with an enormous grassroots publishing industry desperate for new posts to keep people buying their papers. They successfully named ordinary riot control for the period a massacre, and people bristling at an oppressive amount of everyday, what we today might call police brutality, bought it. So this is this is really an important historiographical question right now, because for a long time, many historians have looked at the Boston Massacre and said, that's kind of inflated. The soldiers were fearing for their lives. It wasn't the massacre that it was made out to be. Only 5 people died. And yet, I think today, right now, as I'm speaking, we've got protests going on all over the country over police brutality. And what is, does it matter that the number of victims of police brutality number in the thousands, or is it an entire culture that we need to protest against right now? And is police brutality more visible today because of the media around it? I mean, for people who have lived in communities, especially communities of color, that have consistently been oppressed by police brutality for the last century, there's really nothing new about what's happening in our country right now. But the only thing that's new about it is that in the past 5 years, these things have been documented. So I should probably work this into the discussion questions somehow, or certainly if anyone wants to write a paper about this, tying protests of the 1700s into protests of 2020 that are going on as our course is unfolding. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. So, okay. In 1772 then, there was another incident that really got the ball rolling in forming a unified resistance to the British. There was an incident where the crew of a British ship trying to prevent smuggling went ashore in Rhode Island and stole some sheep. Hungry sailors used to do that kind of stuff, and farmers, sheep farmers in particular, never liked it. In this case, the Rhode Islanders chased them back to their ship, burned the ship, and killed the captain. The Crown, so meaning the government in Britain, wanted to try the perpetrators in London, but New Englanders were offended that the Crown didn't trust their own legal system. Samuel Adams, in campaigning for a trial in New England and for the independence of colonial judges more broadly, created what he called a committee of correspondence, basically a complaint service, a letter writing circle. Every successful revolution in history has had something similar, a way for people to share their grievances and therefore recognize that the revolutionaries are the one who can solve their grievances. The French, a decade later, for example, would call theirs cahiers de doléances, or complaint boxes. So thus, by the time of the Boston Tea Party in 1773, there was already an established infrastructure in place for disobeying the Crown. Tea was thrown into the harbor. Parliament passed what the media of New England quickly labeled as the Intolerable Acts, basically closing the harbor by naval force, Boston Harbor, until Bostonians paid for the tea that they had destroyed. Down in Virginia, members of the Assembly voiced solidarity with Boston. So in retaliation, the king dissolved their assembly. So you now had a bunch of unemployed politicians in Virginia who, in order to find another job, formed a Continental Congress in September as a way to unify policies towards Britain across the English-speaking North American colonies, the 13 colonies. In January of the next year, the British Prime Minister offered to let Americans be in control of their own taxation again. The salutary neglect of previous decades where the Americans kind of just did their own thing. But you now had an institutionalized system of rebellion in place, so it didn't work. Similarly, hotheads in Britain would later reject the olive branch petition of the new Congress, hoping to mend ties, which came after the first battles of the war. So in April 1775, royal troops attempted to seize a weapons cache in Lexington, near Boston. The Americans fought back there and at Concord and killed hundreds of troops through guerrilla tactics. They then fought a few weeks later at Bunker Hill, losing the battle, but killing almost 1,000 British troops in their retreat. That's when Nathaniel Greene, quipped that he would love to sell the British another hill at that price. So what Lepore does so well in her narrative is to give equal weight to another type of rebellion, that of slaves rebelling for an end to their condition. One thing the royal governor of Virginia did in 1775, in November, was to raise a regiment of freed slaves, naming them after the classical fascination with Ethiopia among Philo-Africanists of his day. 300 men volunteered. By the end of the war, thousands fled to British lines, and 5,000 former slaves settled in the British colony of Nova Scotia, which is now a Canadian province, and many too went on to have lives in Great Britain as well as the colony of Sierra Leone. Harry Washington, as you read, was a rebel, a political leader eventually in Sierra Leone. I've included some details here along with a preserved uniform piece in this slide. But what is so cool is, Lepore is writing that there are two revolutions going on side by side. There's the revolution to establish the structures of American independence. There is also the revolution by enslaved people to fight for their right to have the exact same rights that the colonists are fighting for. And the best way to have those rights was to flee to the British. So that summer then, the Continental Army coordinated with colonial militias to take on serious actions against the British. The Battle of Ticonderoga in May, for example, gave the Americans heavy artillery. And while many thought that their actions were extreme for just a tax dispute, the next year gave many Americans ideological reasons to rebel by planting the rebellion firmly within the transnational liberal ideologies of that era. I put this picture in last semester as a joke while teaching in a physical classroom to kind of shock my students a bit, mainly to make the point, though, that the ideas that transformed the American Revolution into a serious movement for liberalism were so well articulated that they have been built upon by virtually every constitution in the world, including the North Korean one. The American Declaration of Independence, which started as an explanation to the king, has become one of the foundational documents in liberalism. The truths we hold to be self-evident, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are at the core of the theory of natural rights and the foundation for liberalism in the modern era. Before this document came out, Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet convinced many Americans to join what he called the patriot cause by again using the latest liberal ideas of the age to call for a people's God-given right to govern themselves. I hope the irony of these sentiments in a place where slavery was so prevalent isn't lost on you. As you'll see in many of your readings for this week, it wasn't lost on Americans in that period either, at least not on the ones opposed to slavery. And, we are seeing that exact same irony in recent weeks. 2 weeks ago, we had people storming state capitals in full battle gear that were generally treated cordially by people guarding those capitals. And yet today we're seeing people being shot with rubber bullets, being beaten, being sprayed with tear gas, who are peacefully protesting unarmed. We've got serious problems and have had serious problems in our country for a long time. So with this slide, I just want to emphasize that ideas alone weren't enough. The Continental Army was horribly funded. The Continental Congress was rarely able to muster the willpower it needed to keep funding the fight. Without French as well as Spanish and Dutch assistance, perhaps the colonists wouldn't have won their fight against Britain. But when the defeat at Yorktown finally happened in 1781, it caused excitement around the world. There was a new country now founded in an anti-colonial rebellion based on the latest ideas of liberalism. Liberals and Enlightenment thinkers around the world were hopefully optimistic that the American experiment just might work. And I think we're just as hopeful 238 years later, though perhaps a tiny bit more confident in ourselves. So in this slide, I just outlined some of the contributions of non-American forces to the American Revolution. So there's a rather broad consensus that the Articles of Confederation, which were first agreed upon in 1776 as a way to unify the colonies in their fight, that they didn't really work. That the new union needed a stronger set of rules and procedures to be able to really function and help us last as a country. While the Confederation sort of worked during the war, after the war, it couldn't collect taxes, regulate trade, or, as the many blunders of the war showed, even provide for a common defense. But they weren't totally worthless. This aerial photograph is where I grew up in central Wisconsin. You notice all the straight lines. It's like I grew up in a grid. They are divisions into square miles, which is basically how large parts of the country, from western New York all the way across this vast continent that is the United States of America, are split up. That's a legacy of the Articles of Confederation's control over the assessment of land value and population to determine each colony's contribution to the war effort. George Washington, though a surveyor himself, wasn't as impressed, as you can see from the quote on this slide, about how much he hated the Articles of Confederation. So an important turning point that I'm sure you've heard of before getting into the Constitution, or before in getting the Constitution pushed through, was what was called the Shays Rebellion in western Massachusetts. This rebellion had two goals: to increase the circulation of paper money, not just minted silver and gold coins, but paper money to allow for easier commodification of agricultural products so that farmers could have money to pay, most importantly, their mortgages. They also revolted for an end to bank foreclosures on their farm properties. The rebellion was eventually put down by a private militia raised by the Boston business community. The fact that it was put down on the eve of the Constitutional Convention made clear to many Americans that the new country would need both provisions for some sort of a military and a common currency. From May to September of that same year, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia. At its core, the Constitution was meant to outline the functioning and powers of government, while clearly defining the limits of government. In the classically liberal mindset of the era, a constitution was meant to limit the powers of government in favor of the basic natural rights of the people. One innovation of the American Constitution that's going to be relevant over the next couple of weeks readings is the idea of federalism, that power could be shared by state governments and an overarching federal government. A confederation, by contrast, is independent states coming together for a certain purpose. That's an interesting side note, by the way. State is how you say a country. In the U.S., we call our provinces states as a way to mark that idea of federalism. The discrepancy between whether states or the federal government is in charge, especially of the question of slavery, would lead to a civil war. So to at least try to make that federalism work then, what the Constitutional Convention eventually compromised on was to have a bicameral legislature, two houses, where the congressional seats are granted as a proportion of a state's population, but the Senate draws 2 senators from every state. Then an electoral college from each state decides on the executive branch, and that was finally worked out by our 4th election. It's a recipe for serious disenfranchisement, but it was a compromise that made small states feel like they could cooperate with big states. Over 200 years later, we still complain about it, but unlike most governments in the world from 200 years ago, ours is still around. So, at the very start, the issue of slavery was enshrined in our Constitution. Southerners argued that slaves should count towards representation in Congress. Since those slaves couldn't vote, the eventual compromise was that slaves could be counted as 3/5 of a person. The Electoral College then allowed slave owners to be disproportionately strong in the new federation. They could count 60% of their slaves in promoting legislation which went against the interests of most Americans, and especially went against the interests of the slaves. That's still a problem today. People who can't vote, like children, or undocumented immigrants, or felons, count for the electoral and representative count, but they have no right to vote. So in states like Arizona, you often have people who vote against the interests of undocumented immigrants who have more power to vote against the undocumented people because of the undocumented people who are counted in the appropriation of Arizona congressional seats, for instance. So another problem with the new Constitution was rights for women. In some states, American women had the right to vote when the Constitution was ratified. New Jersey would be the last state to revoke that right for women in 1807. So until 1807, women in New Jersey could vote. And they've been able to since 1920, of course. So the Women's Rights Convention would zero in on the issue of votes for women in 1848 in Seneca Falls. It wasn't just in the United States that people protested the lack of democratic rights for women. During the French Revolution, Olympe de Gouges pointed to the hypocrisy of a male-dominated revolution, supposedly for all. She was executed for being an unnatural woman in 1794. American women wouldn't vote until 1920. French women, not until 1944. So one part of the Constitution that was tagged on at the end was the Bill of Rights, which many of us see as the most important part of the Constitution today. It's at least the one where we can typically cite what some of the amendments are. It wasn't originally planned as part of the Constitution, but was added as a way to sort of sweeten the deal for skeptics. It builds off the English Bill of Rights from 100 years previous and was directly inspired by the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. So while the Constitution defines the limits and procedures of government, this defines the rights and limits that cannot be infringed. I hope you're familiar with the Bill of Rights. It sets up the framework for all other amendments to the Constitution. So some of the thinkers that emerged out of the American Revolution that have had a profound impact on other liberal movements in the world are listed here mainly as ideal types of the kinds of ideas that came out of the American experience. You have Jefferson, whose ideas on infusing a republic with democracy meshed well with the liberal aspirations of much of the world. He was also a physiocrat who believed in wealth based on agricultural production. His role in drafting the Declaration of Independence and eventual Constitution cemented his role in the history of classical liberalism. He's also remembered, among other things, for his statements on the freedom of the press. Most of you are probably aware that his history of slave owning complicates and even undermines much of his legacy. John Adams, then, was remembered for his insistence on the rule of law, especially the need for a continuation of English common law. He believed in the need for a strong federal government and was suspicious that democracy taken too far could produce the kind of mob rule he felt to be present in the French Revolution. Then you've got Alexander Hamilton, who really pioneered the idea of a government that could provide support for a society built on the new ideas of capitalism. Finally, for the revolution to succeed, it seems like so many revolutions since then, it needed a person around whom a cult of personality could be built. That farmer and slaveholder of good manners, martial prowess, and solid Republican sentiments was George Washington, a modern American Cincinnatus, named the Roman farmer who became a dictator in time of need, then returned to his farm when the emergency was over, rather than seizing power for himself, as Julius Caesar would later do. So Washington led the Continental Army and was the first president of the United States, and a person who has almost universally been admired, both in his own period and ever since. So this slide outlines the divisions that would lead to the first two political parties, divisions that existed at the beginning of the Republic and still define many aspects of our political culture to this day. You had Federalists who hoped that a strong federal government could help develop industry and a prosperous, lasting country. They advocated things like tariffs, taxation policies, investment in infrastructure, and importantly, a national bank that could allow for a single government-backed currency. They followed the ideas of Adam Smith and wanted to promote a strong capitalist republic. People like John Adams and especially Alexander Hamilton were key early Federalists. They were opposed by those who favored the ethics of a small agrarian republic. Let England dominate in manufactures, so they reasoned. Adam Smith called for states to focus on their marginal advantages. Manufacturing wasn't something for the young United States of America. So these people distrusted a large government. They opposed tariffs. They opposed funding for infrastructure, and they were terrified of a national bank. They liked rural culture more than that of cities, and ironically, especially since they were all about liberty, were often more in favor of slavery than Federalists. Thomas Jefferson would be a key Republican thinker, as would, again ironically, the writer of most of the Federalist Papers, James Madison, though he would waffle later. Remember, too, the Republicans of the early 1800s are not the same as the Republican Party today, which was founded in opposition to slavery and in favor of business. In the United States, while the French Revolution was starting, our country was still in the middle of the Federalist-anti-Federalist debate. Borrowing in part from the French, many began to refer to the nation when they talked about all the states together. In much of the world, nation is tied to ethnicity. In the United States, and a lot of our hemisphere, it mostly isn't. For most Americans, nation means the country. For the French, nation meant ethnically French speakers. One of the key things that nationalism meant in America then was the need for a strong federal government. And this was the program of the early Federalists. In your readings for this week, you're looking at Hamilton's ambitious plans to not only build a foundation for a new country, but also to build a foundation for a country that could seize upon the new ideas of capitalism and industrialization, ideas that hadn't fully developed anywhere yet. The U.S. was on the cutting edge. One thing that Hamilton argued vociferously for was to have the federal government assume the national debt for the sake of American credit and credibility in the world. He also put together an ambitious plan that would involve deficit spending. This is really key. So any time in history that a country has modernized, they've had to create wealth, meaning productivity from something. When the Soviet Union modernized, they forced farmers to produce more with less inputs for lower prices, using the surplus they generated to build giant factories, dams, and transportation infrastructure. It worked, but caused the deaths of perhaps 3 million people, primarily in Ukraine, through an artificial famine. In the 1700s, places like Prussia tried to get people just to work harder. The Netherlands encouraged business speculation. The Ottomans tried to standardize government structures. The United States gambled on debt. That debt, as raised through government bonds sold to wealthy Americans and European capital holders, might increase productivity. It worked, stimulated our young economy, and it's something that Republicans found highly dubious then, and many have found dubious ever since. Many of you received stimulus checks in the mail as another idea of how to use debt to stimulate a suffering economy. Did you take the money or did you return it? If we were in a classroom, I'd make a funny face right now, and some of you would say something witty. So the bottom line is that when you don't have resources, can you spur productivity with debt? Many of you have made that gamble with student loans. I know I did. So one of the key opposition camps that you'll see in this reading, and we'll refer to it more, often referred to Adam Smith's points as well. It's like how in political debates today, we like to reference the founders regardless of our stance. One of the opposition camps coalesced around the anti-federalists or Republicans who believed that real wealth didn't come from manufacturing or value-added productivity, but from agriculture. These physiocrats adhered to ideas that were developed in Prussia and France, and they believed that well-ordered farmers could become the foundation of society. A lot of this week's readings focus on Madison's efforts to crystallize the platform of the early Republicans, believing things like America would be better as a small, rural, agrarian paradise. As the course continues, we'll see many attempts to try to unify an agrarian and industrial vision of America. I hope it's clear to you that these visions often ignored or minimized slavery. Republicans' biggest backers in this period were slave owners and small Western farmers. Slave owners disliked taxes, tariffs, as they made the stuff they wanted to grow more expensive to buy, or as they made the stuff they wanted to buy more expensive, and they exported raw materials anyways, not manufactured goods, and investments in infrastructure, as they often functioned as self-contained feudal manors. Westerners also disliked overbearing government as they sought the seeming freedoms of the frontier. So, at first, the French Revolution worried Federalists, even before the Terror began in 1794, where 40,000 people lost their lives, executed for being suspected of opposing the revolution. But the same year as the Terror occurred, many in the frontier region of the United States were inspired by the violence of France to rebel themselves. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 was in protest of the federal government's liquor tax. Whiskey was the easiest way to market corn grown in the frontier region, wouldn't spoil in transit, and the volume of liquor is much less than the corn it's distilled from. It's also a high-value product. And like the previous Shays Rebellion, it was hard to have enough currency to pay taxes in what was still largely a barter economy. This rebellion was put down by 13,000 federal troops. It was the first and last time that a sitting president has led troops into combat. I guess it happened on the movie Independence Day, too. It was a victory for the young republic, and ironically, a victory for the Republicans, who opposed this intervention. Many frontier voters found the Federalists' intervention to be absolutely disgusting. So, I want to just touch on one other thing that ties into your reading. So when the French Revolution began in 1789, there was already a series of revolts occurring in Saint-Domingue, which was the French island of Haiti. When the what's called Haiti today. So when the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was published in August, again, that's another liberal document that's got some similarities with the American Bill of Rights. It reached Saint-Domingue within weeks, and despite widespread illiteracy among slaves there, its ideas spread like wildfire. The idea that all men are free naturally made slaves say, hey, what about us? Slave owners tried to assure their slaves that the ideas of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen didn't apply to them, but that didn't really quell the infectious fire of these ideas. What made the revolt on what would become Haiti far more successful than other forms of resistance that had previously occurred in the Caribbean was the ideology uniting it, a philosophy of liberalism that could not be compatible with slavery, though many countries across the world would try to combine the two. One person who would lead the rebellion was Toussaint Louverture, a literate free black man with extraordinary charisma and military skills. In Haiti, most of the slaves were recently brought from Africa. And one of the sickening facts that I talked about earlier was that they had very short life expectancies. What this also meant is that the slaves in Haiti came from destabilized regions of West and Central Africa and had a lot of military experience. They knew how to fight, and with proper organization and inspiration, the French couldn't deal with them. So in 1794, the French recognized Haitian autonomy. When Napoleon tried to rein them in after 1802, the Haitians, ready to defend their independence, fought back, creating clever alliances with the Spanish and English as well. In 1804, their independence was recognized by France, which by then had given up most of its claims to the Americas, including agreeing to the Louisiana Purchase, which would transform the young United States of America. But the idea that slaves could form an independent republic was inspirational across the Americas. It inspired people in the Spanish-speaking colonies, gave hope to slaves everywhere, and scared the living daylights out of slave owners across the Western Hemisphere, who did everything they could to try to destabilize, delegitimize, and isolate Haiti, giving the country a long, difficult road to travel. The Haitian revolt especially inspired slave revolts in the United States, along with, sadly, a harshening of attitude towards slaves. So, all right, that was a lot. Hopefully it all ties together for you, and you can try your hand at some focus questions now. Not focus questions, sorry. Bonus questions.